Hello everybody, welcome to Current World Problems. Today we're going to be talking about inequality across the world and trying to answer a big question, which is, why are some countries richer than others? Why are some countries poorer than others? Well, it's a very complicated question, and it gets into a lot of things involving history and economics, well, the kind of things I like talking about. So luckily, this is a subject in which I've spent a lot of time learning about it, especially when it comes to something called political economy, which is kind of a fusion of political science and economics. And those were some of my favorite things to learn about back in college. So I'm excited to talk about this today for Current World Problems. The big word that we want to talk about is inequality. What does it mean? Well, unequal is basically what it means. It means where some people have less access to either income or wealth. That is what inequality is all about. So what is income? What is wealth? Well, let's talk about it. Income is the amount of money that people earn every year from work and investments. So it's every year you get some amount of money that comes to you, that is your income. However, there's also something called wealth. Wealth is the total worth of all possessions and or also known as assets that people have. So basically everything that you can possibly say is yours. So for example, let's just say a bike. A bike isn't, something that you get an income of. You don't get a selection of bikes every year, but it's something that you buy with the money that you have. Or of course you can sell something that you own to buy a bike, but once you own the bike, it is part of now your total wealth. So it's everything that you have combined. So you can hear people complain that their income isn't very high, but if you own something like a car or a TV or something like that, that's part of your total wealth, and it means that you're wealthier than somebody else who doesn't have access to those things. So that's the difference between income and wealth. So there is income inequality, where people earn different amounts of money. Some people earn more than others. And then you have wealth inequality. We're going to mostly be talking about wealth inequality today because wealth gets transferred from generation to generation. If I keep my bike in really good working order, I can let maybe a son or daughter in the future, they can ride that bike and own that bike. It's the same thing with a house. It's your parents might have a house and they might sell it and they have that money, buy a new house, and then that house goes to their kids. All of that is an example of wealth transferring from one person to another. So wealth is something that can be given away, but income is something that only is earned by you. What happens with wealth and accumulating wealth is that you need... Have you ever heard the phrase that you need money to make money? Well, a lot of this just comes from the idea of wealth. There's a situation where the people who have money, who have access to wealth, I should say wealth there, not money. The people who have access to wealth can make more money by investing. But those without access to money in the first place, and that's also known as capital, it's where the word capitalism comes from. Capital just means the resources that you can use to invest in new things. Can make it, to begin with, you're stuck in poverty. What happens is that if you don't have the money to start off your business or whatever venture you want in the first place, then you can't make more money, and because of that, you're kind of stuck in this cycle of poverty. So imagine trying to start a sandwich shop from scratch. You need some sort of money to start that business. So usually people will get a loan from the bank and, paint up a store and Mr. Westerhoff sandwich shop. So now I have to pay for, I have to pay for the paint. I have to pay for the building. I have to make a counter. I have to have the glass where people can see me make their sandwich. I have to pay for all these things. I have to pay for the ingredients. I have to pay for all the meats and breads and tomatoes and whatnot for the sandwiches I'm making. All of that requires what's known as capital. It needs money to be put into it. If you can't make it to begin, if you don't have access to money, if people don't give you that loan, you can't start that sandwich shop, and you're kind of just stuck where you are. So this is what's known as capital and poverty. When it comes to poverty, it means that you can't take that first step to make more money. And if you have access to a lot of money, well, then you can start your business no problem. And that's kind of what inequality is all about. It means some people have the resources and the means to start their own businesses or start their own investments or anything you can imagine, and other people just are completely shut off from that possibility. That's known as the poverty trap. So here are countries in the world by total wealth, not by income. This is by wealth. And the darker countries here mean that they have more concentrated amounts of wealth. So you can see the top two are the United States and China, but we also have some countries like India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, a lot of countries in Western Europe, Australia down here, Indonesia over here, Japan. We have some countries that have in more wealth. So the total amount of assets that people own and that they can use to reinvest. And this isn't spread out equally. This is just how many people they might have. Some of these countries, especially places like India and Saudi Arabia, have what is wealth inequality. So you have some people who are super wealthy who have access to a lot of capital and people who don't have access to it at all. But in general, you can see the parts of the world, which would be called the global north, which in general, let's say 100%, have more access to wealth, and what's known as the global south down here, where you can see not as much access to wealth. But why is it? Why are there so many countries here that don't have access to so much wealth? What's going on? Let's also look at global income distribution in 1800, 1975, and 2015. You can see that the amount of money that people are making is actually going up. So this is daily income per person, or per capita. That's what that means. When I was a kid, I had no idea what this meant per capita, but it just means per person in your country. So you can see the average person made about 75 cents a day, and most people lived in Asia. So you can see most people right there aren't making too much money. We have the international poverty line, which is here. We had a lot of people in poverty, especially in Asia in 1975, but you can see that line, most people have crossed it into the 2015s, especially in that continent. So you can see daily wages are rising for most people. All right, so this kind of, I need to answer the question now, and this is the very shortened version of this, but why are some countries poor? And this is a complicated issue, and I have just one slide about it here, because I've even done this where you can talk about this for 6 months, and you can have whole classes devoted for it. But here are the 4 reasons that I thought of and put down. So why are some countries poor? A lot of times it's about resources and geography, just access to minerals or to things that you can extract from the ground, things like oil, but also things like farmland and forests and everything that you need to start, businesses to begin with. Some countries just don't have access to that because it's either dry or it's like a desert and places like that. And that's also why it's called the global south, because in general countries around here tend to be drier and not have as much farmland. That's just one reason. Geography has a lot to do with it. Another big one is the effects of colonialization. Especially in the 1800s, there were a lot of countries, especially here in Western Europe and even places like the US, that went to a lot of countries here in what's known as the Global South and extracted a lot of resources and wealth from those countries to make manufactured goods and that sort of thing. And that actually, it was to enrich another country at the expense of another. So if we're going back to what I talked about with wealth, a lot of the wealth was taken from these countries here in the global south when it even comes to things like the spice trade and all that. And, cotton that was grown in India. There's lots of different examples of this. Even oil that was extracted from a lot of these countries here in the Middle East. Colonialization in Africa too. South America, a lot of these places had a lot of their resources either extracted and then taken to be put into manufactured goods up here in Europe. That was pretty common. And what happened though was after World War II, where we had decolonialization, all these countries becoming their own states, their own nations here, they were kind of left on the back foot to where they had to start basically from scratch. Despite all this economic advancement that had happened in their countries, they kind of had to start from scratch. And that's why a lot of them we would call developing nations, developing economies. Because while these other countries had somewhat of a leg up because they were extracting resource wealth and that sort of thing, and manufacturing, and kind of going through the Industrial Revolution, a lot of these countries were kept out of that, and now they're developing on their own. So we would call them just behind in development. This is where you have phrases like the first world, the second world, and third world. Those aren't as in vogue as they used to be because now we just call it development, and they're part of the globalized economy. It all gets into fancy wordplay and that sort of thing. But we don't like in general, economists and political scientists don't like using terms like third world country as much anymore. Because technically it's called development. And because we're all part of a big global economy, it leads to a situation to where, the countries that had capital in the first place, that had resources and investment and all that, have now that leg up. And what I was talking about earlier with inequality, the people who have money can make money, well, it's the same with a family, but it's the same with a country as well. And so a lot of these countries are kept in a poverty trap. That's the easiest way I can explain it. There's also the problem of poor leadership and management. A lot of these countries, once they became their own countries, a lot of time what happened was that usually one political party would take over a lot of these countries, and kind of, if the country had wealth, a lot of times the people in power would take a lot of those resources and wealth for themselves at the expense of most people who live there. This is a fancy word called a kleptocracy. This is where the government exists to steal from people, more or less. And this is an unfortunate thing that's happened in a lot of countries, especially in Central and South America, a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa as well, some countries here in Southeast Asia too, to where, what happens is that even though they might have a lot of wealth, quote unquote, it only goes to only a few people, especially ones who have ties to the government. And sometimes people are suppressed from actually speaking their mind and rebelling even violently sometimes. So poor leadership and management is why some countries are poor. And sometimes it comes from relying too much on one export, especially oil. This is called sometimes the curse of having oil, to where having oil can be a good thing, of course, for your economy, especially countries up here like that really rely on it, like Russia, and natural gas especially too. So some of these countries have a lot of wealth because of one export, especially oil, Saudi Arabia being a classic example, down here in countries like Kuwait, in the Middle East here. So a lot of times these countries have a lot of wealth just because of one export, but just like what you've heard before, the phrase your grandma or grandpa might tell you, don't put your eggs in one basket. Well, what does that mean? If you have all your eggs in one basket and you drop it, all your eggs break. If you put them in two baskets, well, now you have less of a chance of breaking them. It's the same thing with the economy. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, metaphorically speaking, or on one export, because if the price of that export falls, well, then you're in a heap of trouble. This is what's happened to countries, especially famously Venezuela, to where you're totally reliant on one export and one thing to prop up your whole economy. Your economy isn't diverse. It doesn't have a lot of different sectors to it. So if oil's doing well, if it's selling for a lot of money, then hey, you're doing great. But if the price collapses for whatever reason, because people found more of it, or because of what's happening now that people are using less of it, that your entire economy now is sunk because of that one resource. And there's all sorts of things there's all sorts of stories of countries that have found oil and have actually found it to be somewhat of a curse rather than a blessing, which is interesting in a lot of ways. So you want a diverse economy, you want a healthy economy, you want to have a bunch of different strengths as opposed to just having one big strength and one big weakness. And that would be kind of my explanation of it. The good news is that we have, population-wise, the percentage of people living in extreme poverty has really fallen a lot in the last 50 years. If you look at, it was going down pretty slowly for over 100 years here, and then it just plummets starting in around 1950, 1960. So the percentage of people in the world who are living in poverty has gone way, way down, which is a good thing, of course. So the amount of people in the world has increased quite a bit. We have over 7 billion people in the world right now, but the amount of people actually living in poverty has gone down, which is extremely good sign. So you can see it's just dropping like a stone here, especially since the year 2000. So the amount of people living not in starvation conditions, in conditions to where they have to fear for their safety every single day, is going down, which is a good thing. So there are a lot of negative things to say when it comes to the worldwide economy and inequality and that sort of thing, but the amount of people in extreme poverty, in what would be considered extreme as opposed to just regular poverty, is going down, which is a good thing. Yeah, so that's why some countries end up becoming poor, why some are richer, and a lot of that has to do with history, and it has to do with geography and the effects, the worldwide effects of colonialization that happened starting even in the 1400s. So everything that's happened in history still has a big effect on what's going on today. So, history, economics, political science, all these things are melded together. And that's always important to remember. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.